Section 46 of L'Assommoir. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Martin Geeson. L'Assommoir by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest A. Visitelli. However, one evening in January, she knocked with both her fists against the partition. She had passed a frightful week, hustled by everyone, without a sou, and utterly discouraged. That evening she was not at all well. She shivered with fever, and seemed to see flames dancing about her. Then, instead of throwing herself out of the window, as she had at one moment thought of doing, she set to knocking and calling. "Old Bazouge! Old Bazouge!" The undertaker's helper was taking off his shoes and singing "There Were Three Lovely Girls." He had probably had a good day, for he seemed even more maudlin than usual. "Old Bazouge! Old Bazouge!" repeated Gervaise, raising her voice. Did he not hear her then? She was ready to give herself at once. He might come and take her on his neck and carry her off to the place where he carried his other women, the poor and the rich, whom he consoled. It pained her to hear his song, "There Were Three Lovely Girls," because she discerned in it the disdain of a man with too many sweethearts. "What is it? What is it?" stuttered Bazouge. "Who's unwell?" "We're coming, little woman." But the sound of this husky voice awoke Gervaise as though from a nightmare, and a feeling of horror ascended from her knees to her shoulders at the thought of seeing herself lugged along in the old fellow's arms, all stiff and her face as white as a china plate. "Well, is there no one there now?" resumed Bazouge in silence. "Wait a bit, we're always ready to oblige the ladies." "It's nothing, nothing," said the laundress at length in a choking voice. "I don't require anything, thanks." She remained anxious, listening to old Bazouge grumbling himself to sleep, afraid to stir for fear he would think he heard her knocking again. In her corner of misery, in the midst of her cares and the cares of others, Gervaise had, however, a beautiful example of courage in the home of her neighbours, the Bijards. Little Lalie, only 8 years old, and no larger than a sparrow, took care of the household as competently as a grown person. The job was not an easy one, because she had two little tots, her brother Jules and her sister Henriette, aged 3 and 5, to watch all day long while sweeping and cleaning. Ever since Bijard had killed his wife with a kick in the stomach, Lalie had become the little mother of them all. Without saying a word, and of her own accord, she filled the place of one who had gone, to the extent that her brute of a father, no doubt to complete the resemblance, now belaboured the daughter as he had formerly belaboured the mother. Whenever he came home drunk, he required a woman to massacre. He did not even notice that Lalie was quite little. He would not have beaten some old trollop harder. Little Lalie, so thin it made you cry, took it all without a word of complaint in her beautiful, patient eyes. Never would she revolt. She bent her neck to protect her face and stifle her sobs, so as not to alarm the neighbours. When her father got tired of kicking her, she would rest a bit until she got her strength back, and then resume her work. It was part of her job, being beaten daily. Gervaise entertained a great friendship for her little neighbour. She treated her as an equal, as a grown-up woman of experience. It must be said that Lalie had a pale and serious look, with the expression of an old girl. One might have thought her 30 on hearing her speak. She knew very well how to buy things, mend the clothes, attend to the home, and she spoke of the children as though she had already gone through 2 or 3 nurseries in her time. It made people smile to hear her talk thus at 8 years old, and then a lump would rise in their throats, and they would hurry away so as not to burst out crying. Gervaise drew the child towards her as much as she could, gave her all she could spare of food and old clothing. One day, as she tried one of Nana's old dresses on her, she almost choked with anger on seeing her back covered with bruises. the skin off her elbow, which was still bleeding, and all her innocent flesh martyred and sticking to her bones. Well, old Bazouge could get a box ready. She would not last long at that rate. But the child had begged the laundress not to say a word. She would not have her father bothered on her account. She took his part, affirming that he would not have been so wicked if it had not been for the drink. He was mad. He did not know what he did. Oh, she forgave him, because one ought to forgive madmen everything. From that time, Gervaise watched and prepared to interfere directly she heard Bijard coming up the stairs. But on most of the occasions she only caught some whack for her trouble. When she entered their room in the daytime, she often found Lalie tied to the foot of the iron bedstead. It was an idea of the locksmith's before going out to tie her legs and her body with some stout rope, without anyone being able to find out why. A mere whim of a brain diseased by drink, just for the sake, no doubt, of maintaining his tyranny over the child when he was no longer there. Lalie, as stiff as a stake, with pins and needles in her legs, remained whole days at the post. She once even passed a night there, Bijard having forgotten to come home. Whenever Gervaise, carried away by her indignation, talked of unfastening her, she implored her not to disturb the rope, because her father became furious if he did not find the knots tied the same way he had left them. Really, it wasn't so bad, it gave her a rest. She smiled as she said this, though her legs were swollen and bruised. What upset her most was that she couldn't do her work while tied to the bed. She could watch the children, though, and even did some knitting, so as not to entirely waste the time. The locksmith had thought of another little game, too. He heated sous in the frying pan, then placed them on a corner of the mantelpiece. Then he called Lalie and told her to fetch a couple of pounds of bread. The child took up the sous unsuspectingly, uttered a cry, and threw them on the ground, shaking her burnt hand. Then he flew into a fury. Who had saddled him with such a piece of carrion? She lost the money now, and he threatened to beat her to a jelly if she did not pick the sous up at once. When the child hesitated, she received the first warning, a clout of such force that it made her see 36 candles. Speechless and with two big tears in the corners of her eyes, she would pick up the sous and go off, tossing them in the palm of her hand to cool them. No, one could never imagine the ferocious ideas which may sprout from the depths of a drunkard's brain. One afternoon, for instance, Lalie, having made everything tidy, was playing with the children. The window was open, there was a draught, and the wind blowing along the passage gently shook the door. "It's Monsieur Hardy," the child was saying. "Come in, Monsieur Hardy, pray have the kindness to walk in." And she curtsied before the door, she bowed to the wind. Henriette and Jules, behind her, also bowed, delighted with the game, and splitting their sides with laughing, as though being tickled. She was quite rosy at seeing them so heartily amused, and even found some pleasure in it on her own account, which generally only happened to her on the 36th day of each month. "Good day, Monsieur Hardy. How do you do, Monsieur Hardy?" But a rough hand pushed open the door, and Bijard entered. Then the scene changed. Henriette and Jules fell down flat against the wall, whilst Lalie, terrified, remained standing in the very middle of the curtsy. The locksmith held in his hand a big waggoner's whip, quite new, with a long white wooden handle and a leather thong, terminating with a bit of whipcord. He placed the whip in the corner against the bed, and did not give the usual kick to the child, who was already preparing herself by presenting her back. A chuckle exposed his blackened teeth, and he was very lively, very drunk, his red face lighted up by some idea that amused him immensely. "What's that?" said he. "You're playing the deuce, eh, you confounded young hussy? I could hear you dancing about from downstairs. Now then, come here, nearer and full face. I don't want to sniff you from behind. Am I touching you that you tremble like a mass of giblets? Take my shoes off." Lalie turned quite pale again. and amazed at not receiving her usual drubbing, took his shoes off. He had seated himself on the edge of the bed. He lay down with his clothes on and remained with his eyes open, watching the child move about the room. She busied herself with one thing and another, gradually becoming bewildered beneath his glance, her limbs overcome by such a fright that she ended by breaking a cup. Then, without getting off the bed, he took hold of the whip and showed it to her. "See, little chickie, look at this. It's a present for you. Yes, it's another 50 sous you've cost me. With this little plaything I shall no longer be obliged to run after you, and it'll be no use you getting into the corners. Will you have a try? Ah, you broke a cup. Now then, gee up, dance away, make your curtsies to Monsieur Hardy." He did not even raise himself, but lay sprawling on his back, his head buried in his pillow, making the big whip crack about the room with the noise of a postilion starting his horses. Then, lowering his arm, he lashed Lalie in the middle of the body, encircling her with the whip and unwinding it again as though she were a top. She fell and tried to escape on her hands and knees, but lashing her again, he jerked her to her feet. Gee up, yelled he. It's the donkey race. Hey, it'll be fine of a cold morning in winter. I can lie snug without getting cold or hurting my chilblains and catch the calves from a distance. In that corner there, a hit, you hussy. And in that corner, a hit again. And in that one, another hit. Ah, if you crawl under the bed, I'll whack you with the handle. Gee up, you jade. Gee up, gee up. A slight foam came to his lips. His yellow eyes were starting from their black orbits. Lalie, maddened, howling, jumped to the four corners of the room, curled herself up on the floor and clung to the walls. But the lash at the end of the big whip caught her everywhere, cracking against her ears with the noise of fireworks, streaking her flesh with burning wheels. A regular dance of the animal being taught its tricks. This poor kitten waltzed. It was a sight. Her heels in the air like little girls playing at skipping and crying, "Father!" She was all out of breath, rebounding like an old india-rubber ball, letting herself be beaten, unable to see or any longer to seek a refuge. And her wolf of a father triumphed, calling her a virago, asking her if she'd had enough, and whether she understood sufficiently that she was in future to give up all hope of escaping from him. But Gervaise suddenly entered the room, attracted by the child's howls. On beholding such a scene, she was seized with a furious indignation. "Ah, you brute of a man!" cried she. "Leave her alone, you brigand! I'll put the police on to you." Bijard growled like an animal being disturbed and stuttered. "Mind your own business a bit, limper. Perhaps you'd like me to put gloves on while I stir her up. It's merely to warm her, as you can plainly see, simply to show her that I've a long arm." And he gave a final lash with the whip which caught Lalie across the face. The upper lip was cut, the blood flowed. Gervaise had seized a chair and was about to fall onto the locksmith. But the child held her hands towards her imploringly, saying that it was nothing and that it was all over. She wiped away the blood with the corner of her apron and quieted the babies, who were sobbing bitterly, as though they had received all the blows. Whenever Gervaise thought of Lalie, she felt she had no right to complain for herself. She wished she had as much patient courage as the little girl who was only 8 years old and had to endure more than the rest of the women on their staircase put together. She had seen Lalie living on stale bread for months and growing thinner and weaker. Whenever she smuggled some remnants of meat to Lalie, it almost broke her heart to see the child weeping silently and nibbling it down only by little bits because her throat was so shrunken. Gervaise looked on Lalie as a model of suffering and forgiveness, and tried to learn from her how to suffer in silence. In the Coupeau household, the vitriol of l'assommoir was also commencing its ravages. Gervaise could see the day coming when her husband would get a whip like Bijard's to make her dance. End of third part of chapter 10. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey.